What happens when a 17-year-old legal prodigy is accused of a crime she didn't commit? Eleanor Cross was no ordinary teenager. She had spent years studying the law, the loopholes, the power structures, but she never expected to find herself at the center of a high-profile trial. When she's dragged into court, facing corruption charges, the world sees a reckless kid, a girl who thought she was smarter than the system. But the truth? The system is the one that set her up. As Eleanor exposes lie after lie, she realizes that this trial is bigger than her. The evidence has been tampered with. The prosecution is hiding something. And the people responsible for framing her, they're the same ones who destroyed her family. With the whole courtroom watching, Eleanor plays a dangerous game, turning the law against those who thought they could use it to crush her. She's not here to prove her innocence. She's here to tear their world apart. But when she uncovers the final piece of the puzzle, she's faced with an impossible choice. Expose the truth and risk everything, or step into the shadows and dismantle the system from the inside. What would you do? Stay tuned for one of the most intense legal battles you've ever seen. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the twists, the betrayals, and the final shocking reveal. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The grand marble pillars of Westwood Superior Courthouse loomed over the bustling city streets, casting long shadows in the morning light. Inside, the air was thick with murmurs, journalists whispering theories, lawyers straightening their ties, and curious spectators shifting in their seats. It wasn't every day that a courtroom was packed to witness the trial of a teenager. Seated at the defendant's table was Eleanor Cross, a 17-year-old girl with sharp hazel eyes that missed nothing. Dressed in a simple navy blue blazer and a crisp white blouse, she sat with her back straight, hands resting gently on the table. Unlike most defendants, she showed no signs of nervousness. Instead, she exuded a quiet confidence that unsettled the prosecution. At the judge's bench sat Judge Bernard Holloway, a man whose reputation for breaking young defendants in his courtroom was well known. With his silver hair neatly combed back and his gavel resting lightly in his wrinkled hand, he observed Eleanor with unreadable eyes. He had presided over hundreds of cases, seen countless criminals try to outwit the law, and had yet to be bested. Today, however, he was about to face an opponent unlike any before. The court bailiff's voice rang through the courtroom. "All rise. Court is now in session." Judge Holloway lifted his gavel and gave Eleanor a lingering glance before speaking. "Miss Cross, you stand accused of obstruction of justice, fraud, and tampering with evidence. How do you plead?" A hush fell over the room. The charges were serious, too serious for someone her age. The courtroom was waiting for her response, for any sign of fear or hesitation. Instead, Eleanor merely tilted her head, her lips curving slightly in amusement. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her voice was smooth, unwavering. The prosecutor, a stout man named Samuel Brooks, smirked as he stepped forward. "Your Honor, the prosecution is ready to present irrefutable evidence that Miss Cross knowingly and deliberately interfered in an ongoing federal investigation. Not only that, but we have reason to believe she fabricated key documents to mislead authorities." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor merely folded her hands and waited. She knew the real trial was not in the evidence. It was in the game of words, strategy, and perception. This wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about exposing the truth, one carefully placed move at a time. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Miss Cross, are you sure you do not wish to have legal counsel represent you? Given the nature of these charges, it would be in your best interest." A soft chuckle escaped her lips. "Your Honor, I appreciate the concern, but I believe I'm more than capable of handling this myself." The room fell silent once again. Judge Holloway's fingers tapped against the wooden bench, his expression momentarily clouded. There was something unsettling about this girl, something calculated. "Very well, we will proceed." Samuel Brooks walked toward the jury, his presence commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant before you is no ordinary teenager. She is a manipulator, a deceiver, and a criminal genius who thinks she is above the law. The evidence will show that she deliberately obstructed an ongoing investigation by altering official records. She forged signatures, created false testimonies, and attempted to mislead the court. His words were heavy, designed to paint Eleanor as a mastermind criminal. She watched him, expression unreadable. Then, as if it were all a joke, she spoke. "Mr. Brooks, would you say that every statement you just made was completely truthful?" The prosecutor frowned. "Of course." Eleanor leaned back slightly. "So you wouldn't mind if I tested that theory?" Brooks narrowed his eyes. "Test it how?" She smiled, the kind of smile that sent chills down a person's spine. "Let's play a game, shall we? A simple one. Truth or lie." Judge Holloway frowned. "Miss Cross, this is a courtroom, not a playground. I assure you, Your Honor, I am quite serious. Mr. Brooks just accused me of forging documents, misleading authorities, and fabricating testimonies. If he truly believes everything he just said, then he won't mind answering a few questions to confirm his own truth." The judge's expression darkened, but he gestured for Brooks to respond. "Answer the defendant's questions, Mr. Brooks. If her game is meaningless, it will be evident soon enough." Brooks sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Fine. Go ahead, Miss Cross." Eleanor's eyes gleamed. "Is it true that the evidence against me was obtained through official investigative means, following all legal protocols?" Brooks nodded confidently. "Yes, of course." She smiled again. "Fascinating, because, according to a sworn affidavit I submitted this morning, one that is officially filed into record, 2 of the pieces of evidence being used against me were obtained without a warrant. Would you like to see the document?" The courtroom gasped. Judge Holloway's gaze snapped toward Brooks. "Mr. Brooks, is this true?" Brooks paled. "Your Honor, Eleanor cut in smoothly. "I'll take that as an answer. Now another question, Mr. Brooks. Is it true that I personally altered documents to obstruct an investigation?" Brooks clenched his jaw. "Yes." Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. "And yet, your own forensic expert confirmed that the signature on the altered document does not match my handwriting. That report was submitted last week. Did you happen to forget about that detail?" Brooks' face turned red. Judge Holloway's fingers tightened around his gavel. "Mr. Brooks, is this accurate?" Brooks stammered. "Your Honor, this is—" Eleanor interrupted again. "I'm simply proving a point. If the prosecution cannot answer 2 simple questions truthfully, how can we trust the rest of their case?" The room was silent. Eleanor folded her hands, glancing up at Judge Holloway. "Your Honor, I believe I just won the first round of our little game." Judge Holloway studied her for a long moment. His grip on the gavel was firm, his expression unreadable. But Eleanor saw something behind his cold exterior, curiosity, perhaps even a hint of admiration. She wasn't an ordinary defendant. She was something else entirely, and the game had only just begun. The weight of Eleanor's words still lingered in the air. The courtroom remained silent, the echoes of her last statement bouncing off the grand marble walls. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Holloway was staring at her with something other than skepticism. There was a flicker of something deeper. Curiosity. Samuel Brooks, the once confident prosecutor, was now visibly shaken. His jaw was clenched, his grip tightening around the papers in his hands. He had expected this to be an easy case, a simple trial against a reckless teenager. But the girl sitting across from him was no ordinary defendant. She was dangerous. Taking a deep breath, Brooks straightened his tie and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to strike the defendant's game from the record. This is a court of law, not a debate club." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Brooks, if I recall correctly, this is a courtroom meant for establishing the truth. And yet, so far, the only person caught lying is you." A wave of murmurs erupted from the spectators. The jury exchanged glances, their interest piqued. Judge Holloway rapped his gavel once. "Enough. The court will proceed without further distractions. Mr. Brooks, do you have any substantive arguments, or are you simply here to waste my time?" Brooks clenched his teeth but forced a nod. "I do, Your Honor." I'd like to call our key witness to the stand, Agent Leonard West of the Federal Investigative Bureau. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit walked in. His presence alone commanded attention. Eleanor's eyes flickered with something unreadable as she watched him take the stand. Agent Leonard West, a seasoned investigator, known for his ruthless efficiency. If there was anyone in this courtroom capable of cornering her, it was him. The bailiff approached with a Bible, and West placed his hand on it. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" West's voice was deep and authoritative. "I do." Brooks wasted no time. "Agent West, can you confirm your role in the investigation into the defendant, Eleanor Cross?" West nodded. "I was assigned to investigate the digital footprint and document trail that led to the obstruction of justice charge against Miss Cross." Brooks walked toward the jury, gesturing for them to listen closely. "And what did your investigation reveal?" West's expression was blank, professional. The defendant accessed classified case files and altered key pieces of evidence. She used encryption methods sophisticated enough to temporarily deceive law enforcement. A gasp rippled through the room. Brooks turned dramatically toward Eleanor. "So, Miss Cross, do you deny hacking into federal databases to manipulate evidence?" Eleanor didn't react. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Then, she did something unexpected. She smiled. It was subtle, barely there, but enough to send an eerie chill through the room. "Agent West," she said smoothly, "as an investigator, I assume you rely on verified data and forensic analysis before making accusations?" West nodded. "Correct. Then you must be absolutely certain that it was my personal credentials that accessed the federal database, correct?" West frowned slightly. "Yes." Eleanor let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Interesting, because I have a sworn affidavit from your own forensic expert confirming that the digital signature used to access the classified files was not mine." West's face darkened. Brooks spun around. "Objection. The defendant is misleading the court." "Overruled." Judge Holloway interrupted, his gaze locked onto Eleanor. "Miss Cross, do you have proof to support your claim?" Eleanor reached into her case file and pulled out a printed document. The bailiff took it from her and handed it to the judge. The forensic expert in charge of the investigation analyzed the login records and discovered that the credentials used to access the files did not originate from my personal devices, Eleanor explained. They came from an external, unregistered server. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Holloway examined the document carefully before looking up at Agent West. "Agent, is this true?" West's jaw tightened. "It's possible." Eleanor pounced. "Possible?" she echoed. "You mean to tell me that your entire testimony is based on an assumption that I was the one who breached the system? That you believed it was me, without verifying where the login originated from?" West hesitated. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. "Agent West, do you know what the legal term for that is?" West didn't respond. She answered for him. "Reasonable doubt." Judge Holloway's gaze flickered toward Brooks. "Mr. Brooks, I sincerely hope you have something stronger than baseless assumptions." Brooks' face was flushed with frustration. His once ironclad case was beginning to show cracks. Eleanor wasn't just defending herself. She was dismantling them, one move at a time. Leaning back, she crossed her arms. "Your Honor, at this point, I request that all charges against me be dropped due to lack of verified evidence." Judge Holloway exhaled slowly, contemplating the request. His fingers tapped against the wooden bench, a rhythmic sound of deliberation. "Miss Cross," he said at last, "while your argument does raise significant concerns, we are not yet at a stage where the case can be dismissed." Eleanor gave a slow nod, as if she had anticipated this response. "No worries, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "I still have a few more truths to uncover before we're done here." She turned toward Brooks, her eyes gleaming. "After all, I'm just getting started." The air inside the courtroom had thickened, weighed down by the consequences of Eleanor's words. A 17-year-old girl had just backed a seasoned FBI agent into a corner, and everyone in the room could feel it. The jury sat upright, their previous boredom replaced by intense focus. Judge Holloway's sharp gaze flickered between Eleanor and Agent West, as though trying to determine who truly held the power in this room. The prosecution's key witness had just hesitated on the stand, a weakness Eleanor was about to exploit. But she wasn't done. Not yet. Samuel Brooks, the lead prosecutor, tried to regain control. He turned on his heel and stepped toward Agent West with forced confidence. Agent West, Brooks said, his voice sharp, let's clarify something. Even if the digital signature on the classified files didn't originate from the defendant's personal device, she still had motive. She had knowledge of encryption systems. She had access to certain records. Eleanor cut in smoothly. Knowledge is not a crime, Mr. Brooks. If it were, we'd have to arrest every law student in this country. Chuckles rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Brooks' jaw clenched. You had the most to gain from altering those files, Miss Cross. You had already been warned about interfering in legal proceedings before. Isn't that correct? Eleanor rested her chin lightly on her hand. Before I answer that, Mr. Brooks, may I ask you a question? Brooks blinked, thrown off by the unexpected turn. A question? Yes, she said, her tone polite but edged with something sharp. Just a small one. Brooks exhaled in frustration. Fine. Ask. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Do you believe in coincidences? Silence. Brooks frowned. What? Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice still smooth as silk. Let me phrase it another way. Do you believe it's a coincidence that the exact moment classified files were accessed, my personal credentials were conveniently framed for the breach? Do you believe it's a coincidence that key evidence against me comes from sources that seem to keep malfunctioning? Brooks opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to dismiss it, to scoff at her suggestion, but even he knew that saying yes would sound ridiculous. Eleanor continued, her voice dropping just slightly, enough to make every person in the room lean in. You see, Mr. Brooks, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in design. She turned her gaze toward Agent West. I believe in carefully orchestrated setups. The gallery gasped, the tension crackling through the air like static electricity before a storm. Judge Holloway's voice was like a whip. Miss Cross, you will explain yourself immediately. Eleanor exhaled slowly, as if giving them a moment to prepare. Then she reached into her case file and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Your Honor, this is a timestamp report from the federal servers. It logs every attempted login into the classified database. She handed the paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Holloway scanned the document, his expression shifting ever so slightly. Explain. Eleanor's voice was calm, calculated. This report shows that my credentials were used 23 minutes before my personal laptop even connected to the internet that day. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Brooks paled. That's impossible. Eleanor raised a single eyebrow. Is it? Judge Holloway frowned, his grip tightening around the document. Are you saying this proves someone else was behind the breach? Eleanor shrugged. I'm saying that either I've somehow mastered time travel, or someone framed me. The entire courtroom was now electrified with tension. Judge Holloway turned toward Agent West. Agent, what do you have to say about this? West's expression had gone rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. There could have been a lag in the system logs, West said, his voice carefully measured. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. Or someone with high-level clearance copied my credentials in advance and used them to fabricate the breach. The room exploded with noise. The judge slammed his gavel. Order. I will have order in this court. It took a full minute before the murmurs died down. Judge Holloway looked at Brooks, his patience wearing thin. Mr. Brooks, do you have a counter to this? Brooks was scrambling, flipping through papers, scanning his files, but there was nothing. He had built his entire case on evidence that was now falling apart before his eyes. Eleanor sat back in her chair, waiting. The prosecution was crumbling, but she wasn't done yet. No, not yet. Brooks exhaled, wiping his forehead. Your Honor, even if Miss Cross was framed for the breach, she still had motive to obstruct the case. There is still the matter of the tampered documents. Eleanor sighed dramatically. Ah, yes, the infamous altered documents. She gestured toward the prosecution's table. By all means, Mr. Brooks, present them. Brooks hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he pulled out the official files. He walked toward the evidence stand and placed them on the table. Eleanor reached forward, flipping through the documents, her fingers grazing the paper lightly. Then she froze. For the first time, her expression changed. Brooks noticed. His confidence returned. Something wrong, Miss Cross? Eleanor looked up slowly, her eyes locking onto his. No, not wrong. She flipped a page over, running her fingertips along the top edge. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence, it carried. Just unexpected. Judge Holloway narrowed his eyes. Explain. Eleanor lifted the document for the entire courtroom to see. The paper was pristine. No folds, no criasis. Your Honor, Eleanor said, her voice smooth as ever. I was informed that these documents were altered weeks ago. Judge Holloway frowned. Yes, and Eleanor held up the page. This is brand new paper. The courtroom went dead silent. Eleanor's next words were a dagger. Your Honor, I request an immediate forensic examination of this document. Judge Holloway's fingers drummed against his bench. Why? Eleanor's lips parted into the smallest of smiles. Because if I'm right, she said softly, this paper wasn't altered weeks ago. She turned to Brooks, and for the first time in the entire trial, he looked genuinely afraid. This paper was printed yesterday. The room erupted, shouting, whispers, gasps. Brooks' face drained of color. Judge Holloway's gavel came down hard. Bailiff, the judge barked, take the documents into forensic custody immediately. The bailiff snatched the papers off the stand. Brooks' hand shook. His case was falling apart at the seams. And Eleanor Cross? She just sat back, watching, waiting, smiling. Because she wasn't just proving her innocence. She was hunting the real culprit. And she was almost there. The gavel had barely settled from its last strike when the courtroom buzzed back to life. The moment Eleanor revealed that the documents in question had been printed yesterday, chaos erupted. The jury exchanged nervous glances. The spectators whispered furiously, and even Judge Holloway's expression hardened into something unreadable. Samuel Brooks, once composed and confident, now looked like a drowning man grasping at empty air. The so-called irrefutable evidence against Eleanor Cross was unraveling at the seams. Judge Holloway turned to Brooks, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the bench. Mr. Brooks, I assume you have an explanation for this. Brooks hesitated. Your Honor, there must be some misunderstanding. The documents. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. A misunderstanding? Fascinating. Perhaps we should clarify it then. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. What are you suggesting, Miss Cross? She smiled, a slow, calculated smile. I'd like to call a witness to the stand. Someone who can clarify exactly when and how these documents were printed. The courtroom froze. Brooks' head snapped toward her. Objection, Your Honor. The defense has no right to call an unscheduled witness. Overruled. The judge's voice was firm. His patience was wearing thin, and Eleanor knew it. Holloway turned to her. Who is this witness? Eleanor's eyes gleamed as she said two words that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Darren Cole. The reaction was instant. Brooks went pale. Agent Leonard West's entire body stiffened. The courtroom's murmurs erupted into full-blown chaos. Judge Holloway's expression darkened. Miss Cross, you're aware of the implications of calling that name into this case. Eleanor nodded, calm as ever. Very much so, Your Honor. The name Darren Cole wasn't just any name. He was an FBI forensics analyst, and he was the one who had examined the original evidence. If anyone knew when those documents were really altered, it was him. The bailiff left the room, and for a tense few minutes, the courtroom sat in unbearable silence. Brooks was whispering furiously to Agent West, both of them barely holding onto what little control they had left. Then, the doors swung open, and a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a gray suit, stepped inside. His face was sharp, his shoulders tense. Darren Cole had arrived. He took the stand, glancing toward Eleanor with a look that was unreadable. He wasn't a man used to being pulled into a storm like this. The bailiff approached. "State your name and profession for the record." Cole exhaled, adjusting his tie. "Darren Cole, FBI forensic document analyst." Judge Holloway gestured toward Eleanor. "Miss Cross, proceed." Eleanor stood, her hands resting lightly on the table. "Mr. Cole, how long have you worked in forensics?" Cole's voice was steady, but there was tension behind it. 17 years. And in your 17 years, have you ever encountered a case where original evidence was tampered with after being submitted for investigation? A flicker of hesitation. "Rarely, but it has happened." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I see. And Mr. Cole, when was the last time you personally examined the original documents tied to my case?" Cole's jaw tightened. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "Last week." The courtroom exploded. Brooks shot to his feet. "Objection." Holloway slammed the gavel. "Overruled." His gaze flickered to Cole. "Continue." Eleanor's voice was soft but deadly. "Last week, you say?" Cole's shoulders tensed. "Yes." "Then tell me, Mr. Cole." Eleanor's fingers tapped gently against the table. "If you last examined these documents 1 week ago, why were they printed yesterday?" The entire courtroom went silent. The weight of the question hung in the air, suffocating, inescapable. Cole didn't answer immediately. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, as if choosing his next words carefully. And then at last he spoke. "Because the originals went missing." A gasp tore through the gallery. Judge Holloway's expression turned stone cold. "Missing? Explain." Cole hesitated. "The original documents were logged into evidence, but when I went to cross-check them last night, they were gone. The ones you're holding now? I didn't process them. I have no idea where they came from." Another eruption of voices. Brooks was visibly shaking now. "This is ridiculous." Eleanor's voice cut through the noise like a razor blade. "Your Honor, I submit that the so-called evidence against me is nothing more than a hastily printed forgery. And if the real files were stolen, then we need to ask one very important question." She turned, locking eyes with Brooks. Who had the most to gain from fabricating them? The final blow landed. The room exploded. Judge Holloway stood abruptly. "Enough. Bailiff, I want those documents examined immediately. Mr. Cole, you are to conduct a full forensic sweep to determine their origin. This trial will not continue under the shadow of falsified evidence." Cole nodded stiffly. Brooks was spiraling now. His hands trembled as he wiped his forehead, sweat dripping down his temple. Eleanor didn't take her eyes off him. She wasn't just dismantling the case. She was hunting the person who framed her. And now, she was very, very close. Judge Holloway's gavel slammed down one last time. "Court is adjourned until further notice. We reconvene once forensic verification is complete." The courtroom descended into chaos, voices colliding in waves. Brooks stormed out, Agent West following closely behind. But Eleanor, she just sat back, watching them flee like rats from a sinking ship. And she smiled, because the walls were closing in. The courtroom had been adjourned, but the war was far from over. Eleanor Cross knew that as she sat quietly at the defense table, watching the chaos unfold around her. Bailiffs escorted Darren Cole out of the courtroom to begin the forensic verification. Judge Holloway had retreated to his chambers, no doubt to process the bombshell that had just been dropped. Meanwhile, Samuel Brooks and Agent Leonard West had vanished the moment the gavel struck, leaving behind only a trail of tension thick enough to suffocate the room. The prosecution was cornered, but a cornered animal was the most dangerous kind. That night, as Eleanor sat alone in her holding cell, a temporary accommodation due to the severity of her charges, a small slip of paper was shoved under the metal door. She picked it up, her sharp eyes scanning the words written in precise, deliberate handwriting. "Meet me at 3 a.m. North Wing. Evidence Room 4. There was no signature. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Was this a trap? A test? Or an opportunity? Either way, she would not ignore it. At exactly 2:58 a.m., Eleanor slipped out of her cell. She had anticipated every security flaw in this facility within the first hour of her arrival. The cameras had a blind spot near the emergency stairwell, and the night shift guards rotated in 15-minute intervals. By 3:01 a.m., she was standing in front of evidence room 4. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, waiting for her, was Darren Cole. He looked different from earlier. His tie was loosened, his forehead slick with sweat. He wasn't just nervous. He was terrified. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "Then why did you invite me?" Cole hesitated before shoving a manila folder into her hands. "This is everything," he muttered. "Every forged document, every transaction that was covered up, every communication thread leading to—" A footstep echoed from the hallway. Cole's face went pale. "We don't have time," he hissed. "Take it and get out." Eleanor tucked the folder inside her blazer. "You're coming with me." "No." Cole shook his head. "If they see me helping you, I'm dead. You have a trial. Use this. Expose them." Then, before she could protest, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind her. She was alone, but she was armed with the truth. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The case had gained national attention overnight. Journalists, legal analysts, and the general public had flooded the courthouse, eager to witness what was now being called the trial that could break the system. Judge Holloway entered, looking more exhausted than before. Court is now in session. Samuel Brooks stood stiffly, his movements tight. Agent West sat at the prosecution's table, his expression unreadable. They were waiting, hoping the forensic results would save them. They wouldn't. Eleanor knew that before the bailiff even handed Judge Holloway the final forensic report. The judge skimmed through it. Then, with a sigh, he looked up. "The court has reviewed the forensic analysis of the documents in question." His voice was measured, but his tone carried weight. "It has been confirmed that these documents were printed within the last 48 hours. The original evidence is missing." Silence. Then chaos. Samuel Brooks shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this proves nothing. The defendant is still guilty of obstruction." Eleanor stood calmly. "Your Honor, I have new evidence to submit." Brooks froze. Judge Holloway's gaze pierced into her. "Miss Cross, if this is another stunt—" "It's not." She pulled out the manila folder and handed it to the bailiff. As the judge flipped through the pages, something changed in his expression. His fingers clenched around the paper. His jaw tightened. And then he spoke. "Mr. Brooks." The prosecutor swallowed hard. "Why, yes, Your Honor." Judge Holloway's next words were a death sentence. "You're under investigation for evidence tampering." The room erupted. Brooks staggered back, his face drained of all color. That's absurd. You can't." The judge cut him off. "Bailiff, remove Mr. Brooks from this courtroom immediately." Brooks began shouting, his words frantic. "This isn't possible. She's a kid, a child. You're going to believe her over me." But it didn't matter. The handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. He was done. As Brooks was dragged away, all eyes turned to Agent West. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but Eleanor could see the rage in his eyes. He was next. Judge Holloway turned to him. "Agent West, do you have anything to say for yourself?" West inhaled slowly. Then for the first time he smiled. Not in defeat, in something worse. "You think you've won, don't you, kid?" he murmured. Eleanor didn't flinch. "No, I think I've just started." West exhaled through his nose. Then, slowly he stood. "Your Honor, I will comply with the investigation. But make no mistake, this isn't over." The judge nodded, his expression grim. "Bailiff, take Agent West into custody for questioning." And just like that, the second domino fell. Eleanor stood at the defense table, hands folded neatly. Judge Holloway looked at her with something new in his eyes. "Respect. This court finds a defendant, Eleanor Cross, not guilty on all charges." A wave of relief swept over her, but she didn't let it show. She remained still, composed, as the spectators exploded into cheers. The gavel slammed down one last time. Court is adjourned. 2 hours later, Eleanor sat outside the courthouse, watching as the reporters swarmed around the chaos. Darren Cole had disappeared. Samuel Brooks was being formally charged. Agent West had been taken into federal custody. And Eleanor? She was finally free. But as she looked toward the flashing cameras, the roaring voices, the world watching her, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of the trial still lingered in the air. Eleanor Cross sat alone on the courthouse steps, her hazel eyes scanning the chaos that had erupted outside. Reporters swarmed like hungry vultures, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, all desperate to capture the moment the 17-year-old legal prodigy dismantled the prosecution. She had won, but the victory felt hollow. Samuel Brooks had been arrested. Agent Leonard West had been taken into custody. The corruption they had tried so hard to bury was now spilling into the light. And yet, Eleanor knew better than to believe it was over. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that the real power players never revealed themselves in the first act. And sure enough, her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. Miss Cross, a voice purred from the other end. It was male, deep, smooth, too smooth. You're an impressive young woman. Eleanor didn't respond. The voice chuckled. Ah, I see. You don't trust unknown callers. Smart. She exhaled. I don't have time for games. Oh, but Miss Cross, the man murmured, this is a game. And you just made your first real move. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. And you are. The voice remained calm. Consider me an interested party. Silence stretched between them. Then the man spoke again, lower this time. You have no idea who you just went to war with. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the phone. She had an idea. Brooks and West were just the face of the corruption. But the system itself? That was something bigger. I'm listening, she said finally. The voice hummed in amusement. Good girl. I'd like to meet. In person. There's something you need to see. Eleanor hesitated. Every instinct screamed trap. But then the man said something that changed everything. It's about your parents. Her blood turned to ice. She stood, her heart pounding. You're lying. A pause. Then, with quiet certainty. No, Eleanor. I'm not. 3 hours later, Eleanor found herself in a sleek, black town car with tinted windows, speeding toward an unknown location. She had left a backup plan. If anything happened to her, a trusted contact would expose everything she knew. Still, she felt the weight of uncertainty settle over her as the car pulled into an underground parking garage beneath an unmarked building. The door opened. A man in a tailored suit stood waiting. He looked to be in his 40s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp behind thin-framed glasses. Miss Cross, he greeted, his voice unmistakably the same one from the phone. Welcome. Eleanor stepped out, scanning the surroundings. No security detail, no obvious threats. Still, she didn't trust it. Start talking, she said flatly. The man gestured toward an elevator. Everything you need to know is upstairs. Eleanor debated for exactly 3 seconds before stepping inside. The elevator door slid open into a high-tech office space, all glass and steel, lined with rows of files and computer monitors displaying classified government data. Eleanor's skin prickled. What is this place? The man adjusted his cuffs. Let's call it a private records archive. She turned toward him. Who do you work for? The man gave a knowing smile. Not important. He walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick manila folder. This, he said, is everything they buried about your parents. Eleanor's breath caught. Her parents had been attorneys, brilliant ones. They had specialized in exposing corporate fraud and government misconduct. Until one day, 8 years ago, they had died in what was ruled a tragic accident. But Eleanor had never believed it was an accident. She stepped forward, hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. And then, her stomach dropped, because there, buried in the official records, was a connection she never expected. Samuel Brooks, Leonard West. Both had been involved in the last case her parents had worked on before their deaths. Eleanor's vision blurred with rage. They killed them, she whispered. The man beside her nodded. Or at the very least, they covered it up. Eleanor clenched her fists. The case she had just won? It wasn't random. Someone had orchestrated everything to draw her into this fight, and now she had to decide what to do with the truth. The man watched her carefully. "You have two choices, Miss Cross." Eleanor slowly looked up, her hazel eyes burning. "I can take this to the press," she said, her voice steady. The man chuckled. "And it'll disappear before morning. You've seen what they're capable of." Eleanor knew he was right. "What's the second option?" she asked. The man's expression turned serious. "You play the long game." Silence stretched between them. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You dismantle the system from the inside." Eleanor inhaled sharply. "That's impossible." The man smirked. "Is it?" He gestured to the room. "We have resources, access, influence, but we need someone who can expose them without being detected." Eleanor's pulse hammered. This was bigger than she had imagined. They didn't just want her to uncover the truth. They wanted her to rewrite the game itself. Eleanor turned to the files once more, her mind racing. For years, she had fought battles in the courtroom, playing by their rules. But what if she stopped playing fair? She turned back to the man and smiled. "Tell me everything." Eleanor Cross had spent her life thinking the courtroom was the ultimate battlefield, that the law was the greatest weapon. But as she stood in the sleek, high-tech office filled with classified files, she realized something chilling. The real game wasn't fought in a courtroom. It was fought in the shadows. The man in the tailored suit leaned against the desk, watching Eleanor carefully. "You understand the weight of this decision, don't you?" he asked. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "If I do this, there's no turning back." He nodded. "That's correct." She looked back at the manila folder filled with the truth about her parents' deaths, about the corruption that ran deeper than she ever imagined, about who had pulled the strings. And then she saw it. A name, buried at the bottom of a redacted document. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just Brooks. It wasn't just West. It was Judge Bernard Holloway, the man who had presided over her trial, the man who had acted neutral but had resisted the truth at every turn. Her entire case had been a setup, and she had walked straight into it. 2 days later, Eleanor was back in the courthouse. Only this time, she wasn't a defendant. She was the executioner. The press had been fed a carefully timed leak about an internal investigation into corruption within the legal system. And the courthouse was swarming with FBI agents, looking for one man in particular, Judge Holloway. He hadn't seen it coming. As he entered the courtroom that morning, his usual air of authority in place, he had no idea that today his own gavel would be his undoing, until the doors slammed open. Eleanor turned in her seat as agents poured in. Judge Bernard Holloway, the lead agent, announced, his badge gleaming. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering." The entire room erupted. Holloway froze, his usually cold face flickering with real fear. "This is absurd," he growled. "You can't." "You thought you could control the system," Eleanor said, standing slowly. "But you forgot one thing." Holloway's glare snapped to her. She smiled. "The system fights back." And just like that, the gavel fell on him instead. With Judge Holloway, Brooks, and West all exposed, a chain reaction swept through the legal system. High-ranking officials were implicated. Cases were reopened. The justice system itself was forced into reform. Eleanor had rewritten the rules, and she wasn't done yet. A week later, she met the man in the suit again. This time, she wasn't hesitant. This time, she knew exactly what she wanted. He smirked. "You made history, Miss Cross." She leaned forward. "And now, I'm going to change it." His expression flickered with interest. "Ow!" Eleanor's hazel eyes gleamed. "By becoming the thing they fear most." She extended her hand, and he shook it, a silent agreement. The game had changed, and Eleanor Cross was no longer a pawn. She was the player.